Well, when I first published or when there was a first widely read publication about my quantity theory of disaggregated credit, that was in The Economist
Mm-hmm.
in June 1993. It's a weekly paper. I can't remember which date exactly, but it's a June 93 issue of The Economist. I'm sure one can find it on the internet. Some of my references quoted. And they wrote in the economics focus entirely on my paper and my approach, of course, with Japanese data. It was the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
but very positive and clearly pointing out that that's a new approach which explains a lot and bank credit creation and should be considered more by economists, this approach, and should be used by policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
So after this came out, because Economist is widely read, particularly by central bankers and the like, I got letters from JP Morgan, Rothschild, also the big banks, private banks, but also from central banks. Quite a few central banks wrote to me, and particularly the Fed was very active. And because remember, this is pre-internet.
Yeah.
This came out in 1993, and they had to write to me to get the actual paper. I had published it, presented it at several conferences, but it wasn't like you could go to a website and get download the paper.
Yeah.
So at least the advantage was I could see who was interested in this, and the Federal Reserve was very interested. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System wrote to me, senior economist Dale Henderson, and asked for the paper. And he said, and there was a fax, a phone call, everything. This is really urgent because the senior board member of the Board of Governors wants to read the paper. So it was veiled, senior board member. Well, okay, this could be the senior board member, Alan Greenspan, or not. You never know.
Yeah.
But when I sent them the paper, didn't hear back. This was 93. And then when 2 years later, in 95, I was then chief economist at Jardine Fleming Securities in Tokyo.
Uh-huh.
But on a roadshow to the largest U.S. institutional investors, all the big funds in various places in the U.S. And as I was going through Washington, I set up a meeting at the Fed as well. And I then asked, by the way, 2 years ago when we had this exchange of not emails, faxes and phone calls, who was that senior board member who wanted to read my paper? Oh, that was Alan, of course. Oh, okay, that's good to know. Because then another 2 years later, so now we're in 1997, and the World Bank and IMF annual meetings every other year, they take place in some international location, taking turns with Washington. And so this happened to be in Hong Kong, because my company, Jardine Fleming, headquartered in Hong Kong, of course, then was giving a big dinner event for all these globally assembled bankers and central bankers. It's a big annual bash for all the bankers. And because my company was hosting this dinner, I got myself also invited, and I was looking out, and there he was, Alan Greenspan. Okay, of course, always crowds around him. Everyone wants to have a piece of the cake and talk to him, because these were the days he was already the maestro, and of course in this bankers event, he was probably the number one figure. But there was a moment, for some reason, there was a lull, and he was standing there on his own. So okay, that's just gonna walk up. I've got a chat up line. I know he read one of my papers, but obviously that's 4 years ago. So of course he, wouldn't remember that. So I'll remind him of that, and then we can talk about my paper and things. So I walked up and, according to plan, said, "May I introduce myself? My name is Richard Werner. I believe you've read some of my research." Now, I expected him to say, "Oh, really? Like, what's that?" But he said, "Richard Werner, credit creation. Yeah, I remember the paper on Japan. I read it twice, and The Economist, and then the actual paper." And I was somewhat speechless. Well, I mean, he said all the things I wanted to say, so And he remembered every detail, everything. It was slightly scary, actually. So then I said, and also remember, he said, as after my name, he said credit creation, magic words. So then I said, oh, well, would you venture to comment on my paper? Fair enough, especially since he remembered so extremely well. What does he say? He says, can't remember, turns around and walks away, doesn't even say goodbye. What? So what can you conclude from this encounter? Well, I concluded, well, he knows my name. He knows credit creation. He remembers every detail. So it's clearly, there must be a reason why he remembers so well. But he claims he doesn't remember and walks away like, in other words, he didn't want to talk to me. Possibly because he didn't want to give me even more information than he had by even the few things he said. So next thing is, back in Tokyo, I checked out, we had this Reuters 3000 system where you could check all sorts of publications, including all the Federal Reserve publications, all the speeches of Alan Greenspan. And so I just put in keyword credit creation. I mean, that was him saying it. I hadn't said it. I had said nothing. I just said, Richard Werner, I believe you read some of my research. He came out with it. So let's see. He clearly seemed to know this concept pretty well. You know what I found? Of all his speeches and publications, which were a lot, how many times has he used the words credit creation? During his entire time at the Fed. The word count, the hit count was 0. Never. Exactly never. Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Now then I went beyond. Okay, we need to go before he joined the Fed. Oh, bingo. There he did publish it. In fact, it's his 1967 paper in this book by, what's she called? Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, is the editor, and there's various chapters, and he has a chapter which is about gold, interesting, and about central banking, and about credit creation. And if you put these words together, you know what the storyline can only be. When you have central banks, they create too much credit, money creation, which creates boom-bust cycles. He criticized the Fed for the 20th bubble and the 1930s depression. And obviously gold is a hedge. That's safer money. That was essentially, in a nutshell, what he was saying. But he mentions credit creation quite a bit in there, and how this process moves the economy, creates the boom-bust cycles that we've been talking about.
Already in 67?
Yes, yeah. No, I think it's 1967. But you see, so he knew a bit too much. Then he was offered a job at the Fed, and obviously he decided never, ever to mention the words credit creation. Why? Because they were linked to the credit creation theory of banking, which has been swept under the carpet for decades as the fractional reserve theory, and also the present day financial intermediation theory of banking has been propagated. And all the textbooks are full of it, and they were not supposed to mention the old credit creation theory of banking. So the money creation powers were well hidden.
Gaslighting.